Damage control is a funny thing. On the one hand, organizations engage in damage control in order to keep promoting the outward image that those who run the operation are competent, in complete control, and on top of the scandal that has rocked the organization. On the other hand, it's a sign that things are not going well and at least had been out of control to some degree or another. The worse the scandal that caused the organization to go into damage control, the worse the perception is that the organization is in serious trouble. Anyone paying attention to the most recent iteration of the crisis in the church understands what I mean when I say that damage control is something that is not only obvious to those watching with an interest in what's going on, but also undermines the credibility of the organization any way that the organization tries to deal with it. It's a lose-lose situation. In the current phase of the long crisis in the church, we see nothing more than damage control after the long summer and fall of shame. It's a transparent state the church is in at the moment, one where the narrative must be maintained. But first, I wanted to thank my patrons for their support of this channel. If you want to join them in supporting my work, there are links in the description below, including links to my Patreon and Subscribestar, which is now up and running again. Also, I wanted to repeat my call for submissions for my blog, returntotradition.org. There have been a few articles posted by viewers and supporters like you, so please feel free to submit an article for the blog if you want, using the email address in the description. I can't pay for them at this stage of things, but I do want to help get more Catholic voices out there doing this work. Damage control can be defined in the academic public administration literature as an attempt to diffuse a crisis and maintain control of a situation or story. It's a working definition from several different areas of the public administration and political science literature, but it all amounts to the same thing. Damage control is called public diplomacy by the kinds of academics in the political realm who like to soften language and make hard realities not sound so hard or so real. One researcher in this field, Sean Zeller, defined what public diplomacy does in this way. Quote, without direct control of public diplomacy personnel and financial resources, an undersecretary will continue to be held responsible for, yet have no real authority over public diplomacy, a prescription for failure. A new structure must be built. This is sort of a scapegoating example. Clearly, Zeller is talking about the U.S. State Department or some similar organization here, but the point for the Catholic Church is readily understood. We saw several attempts at damage control or public diplomacy by figures like Cardinal Cupich and Cardinal Donald Wuerl in the immediate aftermath of the McCarrick revelations. For a refresher, let's have a look at their response.
The Pope has a bigger agenda. He's got to get on with other things, of talking about the environment and protecting migrants and carrying on the work of the church. We're not going to go down a rabbit hole on this. The record shows that whenever there's actionable information, Pope Francis acts. I wouldn't be so stupid and foolish as to allow him to be recognized. Let's look at all the agencies and institutions that deal with children on a day-to-day basis.
This is what we're saying needs to be done today when we have, and I don't think this is some massive crisis. It was a terrible disappointment. And
for all of us, for you, for me, he was a friend to us.
So we're saying now, well, what do we do in the future to see there's a mechanism so if somebody wants to say something about a bishop, they have a place to go?
Let me ask another question. I think something that's emerging from all of this is the care of bishops for bishops. And I think that's something that has to be addressed, is how bishops can care for their brother bishops, cardinals for their brother cardinals. Will something emerge from this whole situation that could help that?
Well, I would hope so. You know, there are two levels. There's fraternal correction, which is one way of bishops relating to one another. And then there's the wonderful fraternal support.
Pretty clumsy, right? One element of damage control or public diplomacy is an attempt to deflect or to change the focus. An example of this is the case of the nuns who were abused by priests. Note how the pontiff and others use terms like sex slavery and other explicit ways of describing that situation. It all may very well be true. Nothing would surprise me at this point, to be sadly honest. But the sex abuse scandal isn't only about sex, and it certainly isn't heterosexual in nature. Deflection is a tool of those engaged in damage control in order to reassert control over the narrative. We all know mainstream Catholics who hadn't been aware of the crisis or had been ignoring heterodoxy but weren't able to keep ignoring things once this story broke out. Or for many, perhaps it was the Archbishop Vigano revelations that made it impossible for them to continue buying the narrative that all was well with the papacy and with the church in general. To use the tired phrase, many were red-pilled. As an aside, the term red-pilled has become so overused that it's almost cringe-inducing. I'm open to any suggestion for an alternative phrase. Anyway, last summer, between the McCarrick allegations coming to light in June and July, and then Archbishop Vigano's testimonials from August through November of 2018, the narrative dominating the church has been so undermined that there is no going back. The cat is out of the bag, as the old saying goes. That doesn't mean that the powers that be in the church at the moment are giving in. Far from it, in fact. Public diplomacy efforts not only have continued, they have been ramped up. We saw this in the news that broke over the weekend that former Cardinal, now Archbishop McCarrick, was going to be defrocked, a clumsy way of saying that he is going to be laicized. A real laicization by the looks of it, though one can't help but wonder if the Vatican somehow made a deal with McCarrick to avoid letting out all the skeletons in the closet of those in power, because McCarrick certainly would know about those skeletons. Let's have a look at the story in brief. Vatican to rule next week on defrocking of disgraced U.S. Cardinal. Sources. By Philip Pulela of Reuters News Service. Vatican City. Vatican officials will meet next week to decide the fate of disgraced former U.S. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick over allegations of sexual abuse, Vatican sources said on Friday. Vatican sources told Reuters last month that McCarrick will almost certainly be dismissed from the priesthood, which would make him the highest-profile Roman Catholic figure to be defrocked in modern times. As an aside, this is interesting, last month. Why did they wait this long to report it? Anyway, Cardinal Luis Francisco Ladaria, head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the CDF, the Vatican department that will rule on the case, met Pope Francis on Thursday, according to a public Vatican schedule. The Vatican did not say what was discussed, but one source said it was likely that Ladaria briefed the pontiff on the final stages of the McCarrick case. The sources spoke on the condition of anonymity because they are not authorized to discuss the case. Francis, who will have to sign off on any dismissal decision, wants the McCarrick case over before heads of national Catholic churches meet at the Vatican from February 21st to 24th to discuss the global sexual abuse crisis, 3 Vatican sources told Reuters, again last month. It's really curious that they sat on this story until just less than 2 weeks before the Vatican summit. In July, McCarrick, 88, became the first Catholic prelate in nearly 100 years to lose the title of cardinal. The allegations against him date back to decades ago when he was still rising to the top of the U.S. church hierarchy. McCarrick, who rose to be a power broker in the American church as Archbishop of Washington, D.C. from 2001 to 2006, is living in seclusion in a remote friary in Kansas. What they don't mention there is that that remote friary is attached to a school. But anyway, he has responded publicly to only one of the allegations, saying he has, quote, absolutely no recollection, end quote, of an alleged case of sexual abuse of a 16-year-old boy more than 50 years ago. He has not responded publicly to separate allegations by several priests and ex-priests who have come forward alleging he had used his authority to coerce them to sleep with him when they were adult seminarians studying for the priesthood. McCarrick has already received one of the most severe punishments short of defrocking. When the Pope accepted his resignation as cardinal last July, he also ordered him to refrain from public ministry and to live in seclusion, prayer, and penitence. The Vatican summit later this month offers a chance for Pope Francis to respond to criticism from victims of abuse that he has stumbled in his handling of the crisis and has not done enough to make bishops accountable. Recently, the Church has also come under scrutiny over sexual abuse of nuns by priests and bishops. On Tuesday, Francis publicly acknowledged such abuse for the first time. If you want to read the rest of that, you can find the sources to that on the Sources blog linked in the description. While it's certainly good news if this does come to pass, understand that this is pure damage control or public diplomacy. And remember, the bishops are meeting in the Vatican starting on February 21st to address the abuse crisis. We've all been told to lower expectations, which is itself a sort of preemptive damage control. The worrying thing is that the early word out of the Vatican is that this bishops' meeting is going to recommend that countries not affected in an overt way should adopt the utterly failed Dallas Charter. To be sure, as far as we know, the abuse of minors has been largely addressed with the Dallas Charter. But again, the issue in this crisis is not new allegations of the abuse of minors. The abuse is the cover-up, and the issue is the abuse of seminarians, and the issue is the promotion of people living the Bay Area lifestyle in the church, some of whom occupy the highest offices of power close to the Pope, and some of whom have been all but canonized by the secular world. Men like the late Cardinal Bernardin and the late Cardinal Spellman. Those issues will not be addressed because the one thing about damage control that must be remembered is this: you cannot, when trying to regain control of the narrative, offend the sensibilities of those on your side. Think about what would happen if Pope Francis were to wake up one day and decide to go full Pope Pius XIII and begin expelling the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah from the clerical state. The media would go ballistic and declare it a return to the so-called Dark Ages. We all know Francis won't do that because of his odd habit of keeping people like that in his inner circle. But the point stands. The Vatican is in a state of full damage control right now. And why? They're not afraid of the relative handful of traditional Catholics around the world who are rightfully outraged about this, nor are they particularly worried about the growing numbers of traditional Catholics across the West. Remember that criminal investigations loom large in their minds. Money, or more likely the loss of federal funds, which make up as high as 75% of the American bishop's budget, is at risk. And remember, the American bishops do send money to the Vatican. And also remember that in the Roman Curia, papal politics are vicious. The older members of my audience will remember stories in the 1990s and early 2000s where it was openly speculated that John Paul II should and would resign from the papacy. There are reasons to believe that he was pressured to resign, to which he had the right response. He stood firm. He died in office. There are now rumors that Francis is going to resign, as his words about wanting to see Benedict XVI's resignation become a normal thing in the future. A proposition which is pure modernism. Don't believe for a second that Francis will resign the papacy just yet. The academic literature is clear on this as well. If an organization or its leaders are not committed to change, then damage control efforts will be a smokescreen. But do believe this, there are people in his own inner circle who will happily betray him in order to put someone new in that office, including themselves. Watch in the coming weeks and months to see who gets promoted. The Pope's special inner circle of cardinals, the C9, has been reduced to the C6, and some speculate it will get reduced further. Those resignations have left vacancies to the highest offices of power in the Vatican. In closing, the Vatican is in a state of full damage control. A papal resignation will come when the narrative completely collapses, if it comes at all. Judging from how the media is still on the side of the papacy in spite of everything we know, I wouldn't expect a resignation anytime soon. As always, thank you for listening and for your support. Pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the Church. I'm Anthony Stein. Ave Maria.